Paul McCartney spent decades hiding his true feelings about one woman. She walked into Beatles recording sessions in 1968 and destroyed everything. She used their instruments without permission. She broke their sacred guy thing rule. The other Beatles hated her presence too. Paul felt pushed aside as his best friend chose her over the band. In 2023, he finally confessed the uncomfortable truth. This woman didn't just break up the Beatles. She broke Paul's heart in ways no one understood. Paul McCartney was born on June 18, 1942, right in the middle of World War II. Liverpool was being bombed constantly by German planes, and families like his had to hide underground almost every night. His father, Jim, worked in cotton sales, while his mother, Mary, was a nurse at Walton Hospital, the same place where Paul was born. The family lived dangerously close to the docks, which were always under attack. When Paul was born, his father joked that he looked terrible, like a piece of red meat with one eye open, crying non-stop. That rough beginning, during a time of bombs and blackouts, shaped how Paul would see the world. When Paul was just 5 years old, he had already learned to fight. He remembered hitting a boy with a metal bar and getting told off in front of the whole school. He needed that toughness later, especially after passing the 11+ exam, which got him into the Liverpool Institute. But his success didn't make life easier. Because his mother was Catholic and his father was Protestant, he became a target. The other boys, mostly from Protestant families, bullied him harshly. Every day at school felt like a battle, and Paul learned to protect himself. These early struggles stuck with him and would later show up in songs that talked about survival and standing strong. Paul's toughest moment came in 1956. On October 31st, his mother died from breast cancer. She was only 47. Paul was just 14 and couldn't believe it. She had kept the illness a secret, and after surgery, she passed from a blood clot. Paul's first thought was heartbreaking. He asked what they would do without her money. Mary had been the main breadwinner. His last memory of her was teasing her for how she said the word ask. That guilt never left him. Just a few months later, he wrote his first song, "I Lost My Little Girl," as a way to process his grief. That loss would stay deep inside him, and years later, when he dreamed of her telling him everything would be okay, it inspired one of his most famous songs, "Let It Be." Paul's father, Jim, was more than a salesman. He was a talented musician who played piano and trumpet. He had worked at the Hippodrome Theatre in Liverpool and learned music just by listening every night while running the spotlights. In 1957, Jim gave Paul a trumpet, hoping he'd follow in his footsteps. But Paul soon realized he couldn't sing and play trumpet at the same time. So he traded it for a guitar that cost $15. That simple choice completely changed music history. The guitar gave Paul a way to sing and create songs at the same time. His father's love for old music deeply influenced Paul's style, especially his fondness for strong melodies and catchy tunes. Even with school and music, Paul still had to work. In 1958, at age 16, he took on tough jobs just to help the family. He delivered coal during freezing mornings and swept floors at a cotton mill where the machines were so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. His grandfather had spent his life cutting tobacco at Cope's warehouse, and his father had worked in Liverpool's cotton exchange. These experiences taught Paul about working people, their pain, pride, and humor. It was this world that shaped many of the Beatles' songs that honored everyday life. When Paul was 10 years old in 1952, something terrifying happened. He almost drowned while swimming with friends in one of Liverpool's flooded quarries. These deep pits looked fun, but were deadly. Filled with freezing water and leftover mining equipment, they were traps for children. Paul slipped under, and his friends had to pull him out. Many kids had died in those waters. That scare left him with a fear of swimming that stayed for life. and maybe even a stronger sense of how fragile life could be. Then came the day that changed everything. On July 6, 1957, Paul went to a church fete at St. Peter's in Woolton. It was hot and sunny. He watched a boy named John Lennon play guitar using strange chords he'd learned from his mum. Paul, who was left-handed, flipped John's guitar upside down and played 20 Flight Rock perfectly, singing every word. He also sang Long Tall Sally like a pro. The band couldn't believe it. He could play, sing, tune guitars, and knew all the hits. That moment was the beginning of a partnership that would shake the world. 2 weeks later, Pete Shotton saw Paul riding his bike and casually invited him to join John's band, the Quarrymen. Paul said he would, after scout camp and a family holiday in Filey. His first real gig with the group came on October 18, 1957. Everyone wore matching jackets they paid off slowly, bit by bit. What made this even more emotional was that John's mother, Julia, had died just 3 months earlier. Paul understood that pain. He had lost his own mother the year before. That shared grief brought them closer, and their music would carry the emotions they couldn't say out loud. By 1959, Paul and John were skipping school to write songs in Paul's bedroom at 20 Forthlin Road. They sat face to face, writing and recording ideas using a cheap tape recorder. Their first song together was Too Bad About Sorrows. Then came Just Fun, and an instrumental called Looking Glass. They treated songwriting like work, building a notebook filled with over 100 songs, long before they were famous. This was the foundation of their future success. But not everything went smoothly. On that same first Quarrymen performance in October 1957, Paul had one job: play a solo on Guitar Boogie. He had practiced it again and again, but when the moment came, nerves got the better of him. He froze, stumbled through the song, and felt completely humiliated. He nearly quit music altogether. But instead of giving up, he decided he wasn't cut out to be a lead guitarist. That failure made him realize they needed someone better, which led to George Harrison joining in early 1958. That change would shape the band forever. In May 1960, Paul took on a stage name during a chaotic tour in Scotland. For 8 days, the band played behind singer Johnny Gentle. Paul called himself Paul Ramone, trying to sound fancy. They traveled in a cramped van, stayed in dodgy places, and weren't even listed on the posters. The tour was a disaster, but Paul remembered Scottish girls asking if that was his real name. Despite the mess, it gave him a taste of the road life. Then came Hamburg. On August 17, 1960, the Beatles began playing at the Indra Club in Germany's red light district. They performed for hours every night, 4.5 hours on weekdays and 6 hours on Saturdays. The place was full of strip clubs and rough crowds. They earned just a few marks each, barely enough for food. But this grind made them better. Club owners would shout at them to put on a show, and they did. John would act wild on stage, and they started developing a real performance style. George later said that Hamburg is where they truly became a band. During their time in Hamburg, Paul made a big decision. When Stuart Sutcliffe left the group in 1961, they needed a new bassist. Paul didn't want the role, but he took it anyway. He bought a Höfner violin bass from a local music shop. That bass became iconic. He used it on the band's early albums and singles like She Loves You. His melodic bass playing changed how people saw the bass guitar. It wasn't just background anymore. It became part of the song's heart. Everything shifted when they met Brian Epstein. On November 9, 1961, he saw them play at the Cavern Club and immediately thought they had something special. Just a few weeks later, on December 3rd, he offered to manage them. He had no experience, but his style and confidence impressed them. Their parents liked him too, and soon he was guiding the group towards something much bigger. The biggest controversy hit in August 1962. John invited Ringo Starr to join the band. Just 2 days later, Pete Best was out. Fans were furious. Some protested outside Pete's house, and George even got punched by an angry supporter. At Ringo's first recording session, the producer didn't trust him and used a session drummer instead. Ringo thought he might be kicked out too, but in the end, the new lineup clicked, and it changed everything. Their first single, Love Me Do, came out on October 5, 1962. It didn't top the charts right away, but reached number 17 in the UK by November. Paul sang harmony and played bass, while John handled the harmonica. They recorded 3 versions with different drummers. When the song finally came to the US in 1964, it hit number 1. That was their 4th US number 1 hit in the same year, breaking records and launching them to global fame. It all began on February 9, 1964, when 4 young men from Liverpool stepped onto the Ed Sullivan Show stage and changed the world. That night, 73 million people were glued to their screens, setting a record that held for 3 years. CBS was flooded with 50,000 ticket requests, even though the theater only had room for 728 people. The moment became more iconic than Elvis's debut in 1957, which had just 7,000 requests. During one song, as the camera moved across the band members, John's caption cheekily read, "Sorry girls, he's married." Backstage, Olympic skater Terry McDermott pretended to snip off Paul's hair while everyone burst into laughter. They opened with All My Loving. Then Paul sang Till There Was You, followed by She Loves You, and later returned for I Saw Her Standing There and I Want to Hold Your Hand. It all happened just 77 days after President Kennedy was killed, and somehow this joyful noise helped America start to smile again. Then came March 1964, and something even more unbelievable happened. On the 16th, Can't Buy Me Love was released and immediately exploded. It had already racked up 1.7 million advance orders in America and over 2.1 million around the world. Within a single day, more than 1 million copies were sold. On April 4th, the song jumped from number 27 to number 1 in just 1 week, the biggest leap in Billboard history at the time. That same day, the Beatles held all 5 top spots on the chart. Number 2 was Twist and Shout, then She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Please, Please Me. The following week, they had 14 songs on the Hot 100. That kind of domination wasn't matched again until 2022. But not all moments were joyful. On July 4, 1966, during a trip to Manila, things turned dark. The Beatles had unknowingly skipped a palace event hosted by First Lady Imelda Marcos, which triggered a violent reaction. They never agreed to attend, but when they didn't show up, the media twisted the story. On their way to the airport, angry citizens lined the route. Uniformed men beat them and their team. The airport manager even shut down escalators and bragged about hitting their manager and punching Ringo and John. Even local fans were attacked for trying to protect them. Paul later said they kissed their plane seats once they were finally safe. That brutal day convinced them that the touring life might not be worth it anymore. Then, on November 19, 1966, while flying home from a safari in Kenya, Paul had an idea that would change music again. Sitting next to his girlfriend Jane Asher and road manager Mal Evans, he imagined a fictional band that could free them from being the Beatles. He was tired of the mop-top image and wanted something new. His idea became Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. John later downplayed it, saying it was just Paul chasing trends, And George never really cared for the concept. Still, the project went on to reshape what albums could be. But the magic didn't always land. On December 26, 1967, their film Magical Mystery Tour aired in black and white on the BBC. Shot mostly on an old airfield in Kent, it came just months after manager Brian Epstein's sudden death. Critics were ready to pounce, and they did. The sound was weak, the colors were missing, and the story felt like chaos. It was their first big flop. A color version aired in January 1968, but it didn't help much. Ironically, the film was later recognized as a bold piece of experimental cinema, and the soundtrack still sold well. Around the same time, a bizarre rumor started to grow. In 1966, Paul had a real moped accident in London. Somehow, this small event sparked the Paul is dead theory. Fans believed he'd died in a car crash on November 9, 1966, and was secretly replaced by a look-alike. Clues were supposedly hidden in songs and album covers. By 1969, the theory had spread across American college campuses and newspapers. It finally ended in November 1969, when Life magazine published photos of Paul, very much alive and smiling. That same year, things behind the scenes were falling apart. The White Album sessions in 1968 were full of tension. Paul was trying to keep control, while John, heavily influenced by Yoko Ono, embraced chaos. Paul often told the others how to play, and sometimes just recorded their parts himself. George felt like a background musician in his own band, and resentment kept building. John welcomed Yoko's presence, knowing it irritated Paul. By the end of that year, Paul was leading a band that didn't want to follow. Then, in January 1969, Paul tried to pull them back together one last time. He came up with the Get Back project, a return to their roots with live recordings and no studio tricks. But instead of saving the group, the sessions revealed how far they had fallen. George walked out on January 10th, saying, "I'm leaving the band now." Paul kept pushing, but the others had lost interest. Cameras captured the whole thing, and what was meant to be a celebration turned into a painful documentary called Let It Be. The final blow came on April 9, 1970. Paul issued a press release for his solo album, McCartney, and quietly told the world he had no plans to work with the Beatles again. His exact words were, "No," when asked if a new Beatles album was coming, and "Time will tell," when asked if the break was permanent. His bandmates found out through newspapers the next day. It was cruel timing, just before the release of Let It Be, and fans were heartbroken. But that wasn't the end. On December 31, 1970, Paul sued his best friends in London's High Court. He wanted to dissolve the Beatles legally and stop Alan Klein from controlling their money. The court battle started on January 19, 1971. Paul argued that Klein's management was reckless, while the other three Beatles defended their choice. In the end, the judge ruled in Paul's favor on March 12, 1971, agreeing that Klein had acted carelessly. Paul later said it was the only way to protect their music. The hurt didn't fade. In September 1971, John Lennon released How Do You Sleep?, a brutal song that attacked Paul personally. He mocked Paul's work, called him washed up, and even dragged in George to play guitar. It was John's angry response to what he felt were hidden jabs on Paul's earlier songs. The bitterness spilled into public letters, with even Klein reportedly adding insults. The friendship was gone. Meanwhile, Paul kept moving. On April 17, 1970, he had quietly released McCartney, his first solo album. He recorded it alone at home, playing every instrument and singing every line. Critics hated the rough sound and unfinished tracks, but fans didn't care. It reached #1 in the US and #2 in the UK. That lo-fi album helped start a new wave of DIY musicians. In 1971, Paul took another risk. He formed Wings with Linda, guitarist Denny Laine, and drummer Denny Seiwell. Their debut album Wildlife came out in December 1971, and it flopped badly. Critics tore it apart, and many thought Paul had lost his magic. Linda had never been a professional musician, and fans were skeptical. But this failure laid the groundwork for something huge. In 1973, they went to Lagos, Nigeria, to record Band on the Run, and everything went wrong. 2 band members quit before the flight. The studio was awful. The McCartneys were robbed at knife point and lost their lyrics and tapes. Yet despite everything, Paul pushed through. He played most instruments himself, and the album became his biggest post-Beatles success. It went triple platinum, spent 4 weeks at #1 in the US, and topped charts in the UK and Australia. Wings went even bigger in 1976. From May 3 to June 23, they toured the US and played to over 600,000 fans. For the first time since the Beatles split, Paul performed their old songs live. The band traveled in luxury, while fans screamed with joy. Ringo even surprised Paul on stage with flowers. The tour was captured in a live album that proved Wings had become a serious force. But trouble wasn't far. On January 16, 1980, Paul made a terrible mistake. He flew into Japan with nearly 8 ounces of marijuana in his suitcase. He didn't hide it. He spent 9 days in a small prison cell and nearly faced a 7-year sentence. The entire Wings tour in Japan was canceled, losing them over $1 million. George Harrison was the only one who reached out. That arrest broke Wings, and by April 1981, the band was done. Behind the scenes, Paul had been living through a quieter kind of love story. He met Linda Eastman on May 15, 1967. They married on March 12, 1969, just as the Beatles were falling apart. They had children, toured together, and rarely spent more than a few days apart. Linda passed away on April 17, 1998, from breast cancer, the same disease that took Paul's mother in 1956. He cried for nearly a year, saying simply, "I lost my girlfriend." After Linda's death, Paul tried to move on. He married Heather Mills in 2002, but the relationship crumbled quickly. They had a daughter, Beatrice, in 2003, but by 2006, they had separated. The divorce battle became ugly, with Heather demanding $250 million. The court awarded her $24.3 million in 2008 and described her as erratic and untruthful. She lost control after the verdict, and the fairy tale was officially over. Paul McCartney has lived a life that most musicians only dream of, but behind all the fame and music, there have been moments that shocked even his biggest fans. In 1984, Paul released a film called Give My Regards to Broad Street. It was supposed to be his big Hollywood moment, something personal and artistic, because he wrote it, produced it, and starred in it himself. But the movie flopped so badly that it became one of the biggest celebrity disasters in cinema. It cost $9 million to make, but only earned a little over $1 million in theaters. Just over 500,000 came in during the opening weekend. People didn't just skip it, they hated it. Critics tore it apart, calling his acting stiff and dull, and audiences never gave it a second chance. The soundtrack still did well in the UK, even reaching #1, but it couldn't save the movie's reputation. That failure crushed any hope Paul had of making it big in film. Then came a moment in 2001 that caught everyone off guard. Paul McCartney, often seen as the most polite and calm Beatle, suddenly made headlines for punching a photographer outside a theater in London. This wasn't some tabloid rumor. There were actual assault charges filed. It wasn't even the first time he'd done something like this. Back in 1969, he had punched a Life magazine photographer in Scotland. The charges in 2001 were later dropped, but it shook fans who had only known Paul as the nice one. It happened during a stressful part of his life, and while he kept smiling in public, it was clear there were cracks behind the scenes. That same year, Paul was deeply involved in helping America heal after the September 11th attacks. On October 20, 2001, he helped organize the concert for New York City, which brought together stars like David Bowie, Bon Jovi, and The Who, raising $35 million for the victims and their families. But even during this emotional time, Paul shared something that stunned people. He admitted to using cocaine during the Beatles' recording sessions in the 1960s. Fans were used to him denying or downplaying drug use, so hearing this while he was supposed to be offering comfort after a national tragedy made many uncomfortable. He had actually seen the Twin Towers burning from his plane on September 11th and ended up stranded in New York for a week. He wrote the song Freedom in response and performed it live. But the timing of his drug confession made it feel out of place and damaged the image people had of him as a clean-cut leader in a time of crisis. By 2003, things took a darker turn in his personal life. His then-wife, Heather Mills, accused him of something truly shocking. She said he had thrown red wine on her, then stabbed her in the arm with the broken stem of the glass. She claimed there were several violent attacks, one where he allegedly pushed her over a table, another while she was 4 weeks pregnant, and even a moment where she said he choked her after she asked about marijuana. All of this came out during their messy divorce battle, which was filled with insults, legal threats, and disturbing claims. Heather even said Paul tried to control her breastfeeding schedule after their daughter Beatrice was born. His team denied every accusation, but the headlines were everywhere. People didn't know what to believe. When Paul married Nancy Shevell in 2012, it should have been a peaceful new beginning, but it wasn't. Rumors exploded that Paul had started seeing Nancy before he had even split from Heather. Heather herself said she had confronted him about it back in 2006. Paul denied it, but the gossip didn't stop. He and Nancy had known each other for years. In fact, she and her husband had been friends with Paul and his late wife, Linda. Things looked suspicious when Paul was spotted having drinks and dinner with Nancy at a luxury resort, and then meeting her at a hotel in London shortly after a court hearing with Heather. To make things even more dramatic, Nancy's family was linked to alleged mafia connections through their trucking business. In 1988, her father was accused of having corrupt ties to a known mob killer. All of this made it hard for the public to celebrate Paul's new marriage without side eyes and speculation. Paul has also held on to deep feelings about the people who changed his life forever. One of them was Mark David Chapman, the man who killed John Lennon in 1980. Most people know Chapman as Lennon's murderer, but what many don't realize is that he had actually considered killing Paul first. He had a list of targets. In Paul's own words, Chapman didn't just take John's life, he took away any chance Paul had to make peace with him after years of creative disagreements. They had clashed in the 1970s, and Paul never got to say goodbye. After John was killed, Paul had to keep living in his shadow, constantly compared to a man who was now seen as a martyr. He once said it felt like he was arguing with a ghost. His divorce from Heather in 2008 became a public disaster. She ended up with a £55 million settlement, including $20 million in a lump sum and annual payments until their daughter turned 18. The judge even described Heather as out of control. Newspapers across Britain turned her into a villain. Compared to Paul's calm, decades-long marriage to Linda, the whole thing felt like chaos. Heather publicly insulted him, shouted to the media, and made wild claims. She later said journalists had hacked her phone and intercepted Paul's voicemails during their fights. But because of a legal agreement, she's never allowed to speak publicly about many of the details. His issues with Yoko Ono go back even further. When she started showing up to Beatles recording sessions in 1968, it disrupted everything. The Beatles had always worked alone with their producer George Martin, and they didn't like outsiders in their space. Paul later admitted they didn't want her there because it had always been a guy thing. He said it made them fume in silence. Yoko would use their instruments, move around the studio, and it just felt off to them. Paul felt like he was being pushed aside as John got closer to Yoko. Even after John's death, the tension never fully healed. In a 2023 podcast, Paul admitted it was never comfortable, and that no one in the band really liked the way she interfered. Another painful chapter came in 1985, when Michael Jackson bought the rights to the Beatles song catalog for $47.5 million. What hurt Paul the most was that he had taught Michael about how valuable music rights were. They had collaborated on songs like Say, Say, Say and The Girl Is Mine, and Paul had given him advice about investing in publishing. Michael even joked once, "One day, I'll own your songs." Then he did exactly that. Paul couldn't afford to outbid him, and to his surprise, Yoko Ono reportedly preferred Jackson getting the rights instead of a corporation. That moment ended their friendship, and neither man forgave the other before Michael's death in 2009. But not all surprises in Paul's life were dark. In June 2024, he finally released One Hand Clapping, a music session that had been hidden away for 50 years. It was a live recording of Wings at Abbey Road Studios back in August 1974, right after the success of Band on the Run. It had been planned as a documentary and an album, but it was never released until now. One of the most powerful moments in the recording is Paul singing 20 Flight Rock, the same song he played for John Lennon the day they met in 1957. The album even includes rare recordings in Abbey Road's backyard and unreleased songs that fans had only heard rumors about. At 82 years old, Paul gave everyone a direct window into his younger self, like opening a time capsule straight from the heart of his prime. That wasn't the only late career triumph. In 2018, at the age of 76, Paul released Egypt Station, and it debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. It was the first time in his entire solo career that an album went straight to #1 in the US, and it broke the record for the oldest artist to do so. He hadn't had a #1 album in America since Tug of War back in 1982. The album sold over 150,000 copies in its first week. He promoted it with a viral carpool karaoke appearance and even performed a surprise show at Grand Central Station. While most rock stars his age had retired, Paul was still topping charts and filling stadiums. But his path to royal recognition was not smooth. On March 11, 1997, he was finally knighted by Queen Elizabeth II. It should have happened much earlier, but it was delayed for 17 years, most likely because of his drug arrests. In January 1980, he was caught with marijuana in Tokyo and spent 9 days in jail. And even earlier, during a visit to Buckingham Palace in 1965 to receive MBE medals, the Beatles secretly smoked marijuana in the palace bathroom. When he finally knelt before the Queen, Paul made a quiet, emotional comment. He said, "I just remember the other three. I keep looking over my shoulder expecting to see them." His wife, Linda, couldn't be there because she was battling cancer. She passed away just 13 months later.